It's always something for me to imagine Mary Magdalene's experience through this first Holy Week and Easter. If you flip back one chapter in John to chapter 19, we read that Mary stood with two other Marys, because it was kind of a common name. She stood with Jesus' mother and Clopas' wife, witnessing Jesus' gruesome death, every bit of it. When the men who followed Jesus had scattered and hid, these women stood to witness Jesus' last hours, no matter how horrific they were. John doesn't tell us exactly what motivated Mary's early morning journey that very first Easter. But the other Gospels help us to see that several of the women attempted to anoint and to prepare Jesus' body for its final rest. As immediately after the Sabbath was over, they went to attend to this important work. For whatever reason, John describes Mary Magdalene making this first journey alone. The Gospels show us the closeness that she and Jesus shared and the devotion she felt towards him. After all, think about what sort of devotion it would take to go into a graveyard by yourself before the sun had risen. Not only that, but to go into a graveyard expecting to work to prepare the mangled body of the one that you had loved after watching that very same body being ripped apart, really only hours earlier. And on top of all of that, think of the danger that the same people who killed Jesus might just be in the mood to look to rid the world of a few more of his followers. And yet Mary went. She went to the tomb. She confronted her fears and her disgust head on, and she did what needed to be done. She didn't go to the tomb expecting a miracle. In fact, she went expecting the opposite, the grim proof of her crushing loss. She expected to find the bloody body of her Lord. You can see her mindset. You can see this bleak acceptance of reality in her reaction when she sees the open tomb. John doesn't even tell us that she investigated what happened. She saw that the tomb had been opened, that the stone had been rolled aside, and she just knew it was grave robbers. She knew that somehow her bad situation had gotten even worse. It wasn't bad enough that Jesus was disfigured and dead. No, someone had broken into the tomb and made it so she couldn't even have the closure of a proper funeral. Mary runs to tell the two natural leaders of Jesus' disciples, Peter and John. They then go run to investigate exactly what she's talking about. They look in the tomb and find it only to contain neatly folded grave clothes. And it seems like immediately they understand what's happened. The empty tomb caused them to see that Jesus was alive. They believed what they saw, and then they went home. They saw, they believed, they knew. I bet for many of us, that's where the Easter story normally stops, right? We hear the good news. We're reminded of what we believe. We're happy. We go home. Check. Another Easter has been celebrated. But that's not where the story ends for Mary. As Peter and John returned to their homes, she remained there at the tomb, weeping. She finally looked into the tomb. She finally got that courage to look to what she feared. But when Mary looked, it wasn't empty. Where Jesus' body had been only hours before, now two angels sat to greet Mary. As she spoke to them, Jesus appeared behind her outside the tomb. Even with Jesus standing there right in front of her eyes, even having seen two glorious angels, Mary was still sure that the empty tomb was the work of men of evil intent. The men believed quickly. They saw and they knew what had happened. It wasn't so easy for Mary. Remember, maybe those men saw and believed here, but think of all the things they didn't see the days before. They didn't see Jesus die quite the same way that Mary did. The full horror of his torture, his execution, his death. They didn't hear his last cries upon the cross. They didn't see his chest rise for the last time. Mary saw not just that Jesus was dead, but that he had been utterly destroyed. There was no possibility that Jesus was just having some nice nap that he could get up from. She knew that he was gone once and for all. The horror of her experiences hampered her faith. I've got to say, congratulations, Salem. You are the first church that I've been appointed to where we remember Easter right here in the midst of the dead. Perhaps I could say this even more accurately. You are the first church that I've attended to celebrate Easter a lot like Jesus did, in the midst of graves. I hate that it's just my beloved Connie and myself here, but many of you remember what it's like to be in this very place. As the sun rises, as I hope you can see behind me, over the bodies of those that we have loved and buried. You aren't with me physically right now, but I know that many of you are in this place in your hearts. I wonder how many of us are like Mary today. Here we are, another year like clockwork, finding an empty grave, but we just can't run home like nothing's happened. Sure, we know that the grave is empty, but he's still dead. She's still dead. Yeah, we know in our heads that Jesus rose from the dead so many years ago. But what about today? Imagine there are some of you there right now who are like Mary, while everyone else is celebrating. You're holding back. You're crying. This has been a hard year. We've gathered at this very graveyard far too often. We've gone to hospitals and doctors more than we would like. We have sat lonely and isolated more than God wills. Even in the face of the extraordinary news that is Easter, a lot of us are like Mary. We linger. We cry. Maybe Jesus rose for those guys, but it sure don't feel like he rose for me. It's not bad to feel that way today. After all, you aren't alone. Your tears join a long lineage of sorrow dating all the way back to Mary on the first Easter. But even more importantly, notice how Jesus treats Mary. How would most of us have responded had we been the one in Jesus' shoes or sandals or whatever he wore? The God that many of us invent in our minds would have lashed out at Mary here. How could she not understand? How could she not believe? Jesus had told her over and over again that his death and resurrection was coming. She had seen the sign not just of an empty grave, but of heavenly messengers. Most of our invented gods would have judged her, would have damned her for a supposed lack of faith. But not Jesus. Not the Word made flesh. God incarnate looked on this weeping woman, this woman who had endured so much in her life, this woman who had missed the signs of life that were right there in front of her, and he had compassion. He gently asked her why she weeps and who it is she's looking for. She doesn't get it. She still thinks this is about some stolen body. So in what I think is one of the most beautiful moments of Scripture, he turns to her and says only one word: Mary. He calls her by name, and that does it. She hears, she sees, she believes. It wasn't in some miraculously open tomb. It wasn't in the testimony of the men. It wasn't even in the heavenly appearance of the angels. But it was in one word. Jesus didn't offer a theological treatise. He didn't explain to her what the resurrection proved about him or the Father or about humanity. No, he called her by name. She heard his voice and she believed. This is not a normal Easter. When we started our Lenten journeys all the way back on Leap Day, do you remember that? Do you remember February had 29 days this year? And March has had a lot more. I think we're at, what, 80 now? I know it's April, but anyway. All the way back on Leap Day, I doubt any of us imagined that we would celebrate Easter on a screen in our homes. I'm sure I'm not alone in seeing posts on social media about how no matter what happens in the world, you can't cancel Easter. That's true. The grave is still empty. Christ is still alive, seated at the right hand of the Father. But I bet many of us are weeping with Mary more than in years past. We talked a few weeks ago about the loss that many of us are facing. We've lost our sense of normalcy, of freedom, of relationship. We've lost our sense of control. That doesn't change today. The virus doesn't miraculously stop because today is Easter. We're still seeing locally and all the way around the world the very real effect this sickness is having on people's lives. But notice something. Hear and see the gospel. Who did Jesus physically appear to first? In John's account, it seems that he and Peter were the first to be brave enough to actually stick their heads in the tomb. But Jesus doesn't show up to them. After all, it seems they understood and believed what they were seeing almost right away. No. Jesus appeared to Mary first. In a day when women were literally seen as a deformed version of a man, Jesus honors Mary as the first to see him in his resurrected glory. He doesn't go join the house party that Peter and John are getting cranked up, but he goes to the one who is lingering there by herself, crying because the grief that she faced wouldn't disappear so easily. Jesus seeks out the lowly and the hurting before the exalted and the comfortable. Good morning, Radar. I want you to make sure you heard that over radar. Jesus seeks out the lowly and the hurting before the exalted and the comfortable. On this beautiful Easter morning with donkeys braying, although he stopped, I don't stand here offering you easy answers. I can't make the tears of loss or hurt go away this morning. I can't make this virus disappear and whisk us back into some magic normalcy. But if you find yourself like Mary, if you see yourself as Mary felt in this passage, if you seem to linger in your tears while everyone else seems to just move on, I can tell you at least one thing. Jesus sees you. Listen for him calling to you by name, speaking to the depths of your heart in ways that no other thing in this world can. Like Mary, listen for that voice that you can identify, that voice that you know in the depth of your soul without a doubt. Mary's story is so powerful because it embodies the heart of the Christian message. She witnessed Jesus die for the sake of humankind. She saw how awful his death was, and she saw the great cost that he paid. Even before knowing that he was resurrected, she was willing to pay any cost to follow him. She knew firsthand the joy of his life that conquered death. She demonstrated God's invitation to a changed life possible only through Christ, an invitation that God gives each and every one of us today. Like Mary, like John, like Peter, Jesus meets you where you are this morning to show you signs of new life. No matter how big the evil, no matter how big the death, no matter how big whatever you face in your life is, Jesus is able to overcome it as he overcame the grave so many years ago. He calls out to you this morning to follow him in faithfulness wherever it is he leads you. Will you follow him this morning? Jesus' story doesn't end here with Mary. His encounter with her doesn't end right there in that moment. Not only does Jesus honor Mary by appearing to her first, but he also gives her the privilege of being the first preacher commissioned to proclaim the good news of Easter. She is shown the glory of the resurrection and urged not to hold on to this good news for herself, but to get the word out. We have good news today. And we live in a world that needs some good news, don't we? We face circumstances now that few imagined even 2 months ago. We don't know where we're going to be in a week or a month or even a year. It's hard. It's hard to be isolated. It's hard to be unsure. It's hard just to keep going on. It was hard for Jesus to face the cross. It was hard for Mary to watch. And it was hard for Mary to journey to that tomb that first Easter morning. Thankfully, our God overcame the hardest of circumstances, and he can and will overcome whatever it is that we, that you, that I face today. The world was so different that very first Easter morning. We see that in Mary. Jesus' resurrection so drastically changed everything that she struggled to comprehend just what was happening. The world will be different when we begin to get this virus under control. I imagine that the government, the businesses, the media will rush to tell you everything is the same as it was, to keep buying, to keep spending like normal. But it's not normal. Easter did not erase Good Friday. A vaccine or a treatment of the coronavirus won't erase these hard weeks that so many families have and will endure. But God will be with us. Whether we rush like Peter and John to party with other people now that we're free to go from our homes whenever that day comes, or if we end up being a little bit more like Mary, still grieving what was lost, let's make sure we don't lose sight of Jesus. Let's follow him faithfully into this new world, making it better than what we know now. Maybe, for instance, remembering the gift that we've been given of slowing down every once in a while. Let's rebuild our lives and world with the knowledge of the lessons that we have and will learn in this time. My brothers and sisters, Christ is risen. I hope that at home maybe you said, he is risen indeed. Who knows? Let us be Easter people, embodying the promise of Easter wherever it is that God has placed you. In your homes, at work, even if that still is in your homes, in the grocery store, with your neighbor. Seek to speak the words of Christ. You now are like Mary. You know the Easter gospel. Like Mary, then, you are now commissioned to preach it. Perhaps it will be you. Perhaps God will use you, that some Mary out there in the world may hear in your voice God call out to her by name. Amen.